Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll be analyzing the case of Brian Camp. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Brian Camp was born sometime around 1998 and lived in Southampton, Massachusetts. He worked as a mechanic and had an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Brooke Janik. Brooke worked at a Dunkin' Donuts in nearby Haydenville. In early 2022, during a time when Brian and Brooke were not together, Brooke had a sexual relationship with a man named Jonathan Latendra. He worked as the general manager of the Dunkin' Donuts where Brooke worked. The relationship ended, but Brooke and Jonathan remained in contact. Brooke reunited with Brian Camp. They lived in Brooke's house on South Street in Chesterfield, Massachusetts, where they raised two young daughters. This small town is about 35 miles north of Springfield. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On December 27, 2022, at 12:37 a.m., Brian's girlfriend Brooke called 911. She was hysterical and indicated that someone was attacking her boyfriend. When the police arrived at Brooke's house, they discovered 27-year-old Jonathan Latendra dead on the kitchen floor. 24-year-old Brian Camp had sustained injuries to his hand, knee, and head. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Brian Camp did not know anything about Brooke's relationship with Jonathan. Brian had no idea who he was. Sometime after midnight, Jonathan sent a text message to Brooke saying, "Can you talk? I can't sleep." This text message was sent as he was driving to her house or just after he arrived. Jonathan parked his vehicle on the road outside her house and walked toward it. At 12:30 a.m., he unlawfully entered the house. He had a knife and a pair of handcuffs in his possession. No drugs or alcohol were in his system. At this time, Brian, Brooke, and their two girls, ages 4 and 2, were asleep upstairs. Brian and Brooke were in the bedroom to the left of the top of the stairs, and the girls were in the bedroom to the right. Jonathan entered the bedroom on the left and attacked Brian. Eventually, Brian made his way downstairs, where the men fought over two firearms. At 12:45 a.m., Brian retrieved a third firearm, specifically a Sig Sauer P365 semi-automatic pistol chambered in 9mm Luger. This gun is specifically designed for concealed carry. It's pretty small for a 9mm. Brian used this weapon to shoot Jonathan one time in the side of the torso. The bullet damaged Jonathan's stomach, colon, and liver. He was seriously injured, but not killed. Brooke had called 911 by this point. At 12:53 a.m., 8 minutes and 37 seconds into the call, after Brian had exited the house at least one time, a second gunshot was heard on the call. Brian had shot Jonathan in the top of the head using the same pistol. This shot was fatal. Brian was transported to a hospital and treated for his injuries. After this, he unwisely agreed to be interviewed by the police. He was asked if he shot Jonathan once or twice, but he was not sure. Brian stated that if he had shot twice, it would have been in quick succession. No additional shots were fired after Brian re-entered the house. The police knew this wasn't true. Brian had fired the second shot after re-entering. The state of Massachusetts had no issue with the first gunshot. They believed Brian was justified in shooting Jonathan during the attack. They did not feel the same way about the second gunshot because they believed Jonathan was no longer a threat by this point. He had been incapacitated by the first shot to his torso. According to the state, the second shot represented an excessive use of force. Brian Camp was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter. He went on trial in November 2024. Here is a summary of Brian's testimony. On December 27, 2022, at 12:30 a.m., Brooke woke Brian up after she heard the floorboards outside their bedroom creaking. Brooke looked around the corner, saw Jonathan in the hallway, and screamed. Without saying a word, Jonathan entered the bedroom and attacked Brian on the bed. Brian was not wearing any clothing at this time. Furthermore, Jonathan had a size advantage over him. Jonathan initially gained the upper hand, grabbing and squeezing Brian's throat and smashing his head against the wall. Brooke struck Jonathan with a glass object, which the police determined was a bong. After giving Jonathan a bad trip, so to speak, Brooke ran outside to call 911. The strike with the bong caused an injury to Jonathan's head and allowed Brian to escape. He moved behind Jonathan and put his arm around his neck. Both men fell down during the struggle. Jonathan reached backward as Brian held him and forced Brian to release his grip by making contact with his eyes. Brian made his way downstairs. He retrieved a loaded, muzzle-loading rifle, which was on a service cart in the living room. This is a small toolbox with wheels. Brian pointed the rifle at Jonathan and told him to get the blank out of here. Instead of leaving, Jonathan decided to grab the barrel of the muzzle-loading rifle. He pulled it away from Brian's hands and essentially played keep away with it. Despite this effort, Brian managed to grab the barrel. Jonathan pulled the trigger as the rifle was pointed at Brian, but the hammer was not cocked, so the rifle did not discharge. Brian moved behind Jonathan as they fought for control of the rifle. He activated the release to break the rifle open, which caused the primer to fall out. This meant the rifle could not be fired. The two men continued to fight and fell to the floor. Brian described the combat as a wrestling match. Brian managed to make his way to a nearby closet, which he knew contained multiple firearms. He retrieved a shotgun, which was in disrepair. He pointed the weapon at Jonathan and told him to get out. Jonathan grabbed the shotgun by the barrel, but it broke in two pieces. The barrel was in Jonathan's hand, and Brian had the stock. The two men beat each other in the head with the firearm components they possessed. As the physical combat continued, the men ended up in the kitchen. As Jonathan was swinging the barrel of the shotgun at him, Brian managed to retrieve the Sig Sauer P365 from the top of a kitchen cabinet. He fired a single shot at Jonathan, striking him in the side of the torso. Jonathan fell to the floor. Brian believed, at this time, that he had neutralized the threat. Still not wearing any clothing, Brian checked on his girls and put on a pair of pants. He then brought Brooke a pair of shoes as she was outside on the phone with a 911 operator. Brian called and texted his boss, who gave him the idea of capturing images on the scene, I guess to document what had occurred. Using his cell phone, Brian took a photograph of Jonathan and a few different areas in the house. Brian said that he went back outside and spoke with Brooke. The 911 operator, through Brooke, requested information about Jonathan's status. Due to this directive, Brian went back into the house and observed Jonathan on the floor. Jonathan was still alive, even though he had been shot in the torso. He kept saying, "I need an attorney," and "I'm going to kill you." Brian became afraid because Jonathan was trying to stand up. This was described as Jonathan trying to do a push-up, but with his knees on the floor. In order to protect himself, Brian shot Jonathan for the second time, from 10 to 15 feet away. As far as his statements to the police, which were inaccurate, Brian implied that he had a confused mental state at the time. On November 25, 2024, the jury found Brian Camp not guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Now moving to my analysis. Brian Camp maintained his innocence, and he was found not guilty. The state, of course, disagreed. This brings me to the question, was Brian guilty of manslaughter in reality? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. There is no question that Brian shot Jonathan 2 times. The first shot wounded him, and the second shot, which occurred over 8 minutes later, killed him. Brian took a photograph of Jonathan on the floor about 90 seconds before taking the second shot. Jonathan's hand was over his head, but he was not in the same position when the police discovered his body. Perhaps Jonathan was trying to protect his head, as if Brian had threatened to shoot him. Brian said the second shot was taken from 10 to 15 feet away from Jonathan's body, but the spent case for the second shot was found closer than that. The police knew the case was from the second shot because it was not in the photo that Brian had taken 90 seconds earlier. Brian claimed that he fired for the second time because Jonathan was trying to get up. A physician for the state testified that Jonathan would have been in immense pain from the first gunshot wound and probably would not have been able to stand up. Brian provided inaccurate statements to the police about the second shot. He claimed he didn't remember exactly what happened, but he remembered other details in the 8 minutes between the first and the second gunshot. Brian claimed that, through Brooke, the 911 operator asked for an update on Jonathan's status. This is why Brian re-entered the house. The operator never said, "Go back in the house." He actually told Brooke that she and Brian needed to stay outside the house. Referring to the attack during his interview with the police, Brian said, quote, "If I ever did something like that, I'd want someone to put me down too," unquote. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Jonathan was the aggressor in this case. He was the one who unlawfully entered Brooke's house. He was the one who attacked Brian without provocation. He was the one who tried to strangle Brian, beat his head against the wall, claw at his eyes, attempt to shoot him with a muzzle-loading rifle, and beat him with a shotgun barrel. This entire incident was caused by Jonathan. If he had survived, he would have been prosecuted. Brian did not even know who Jonathan was and was completely innocent. Brian's interview with the police started at about 6 a.m. He was probably tired, and he had just been through a traumatic experience. In addition, he had sustained blows to his head when Jonathan was trying to kill him. It stands to reason that his statement would not be 100% accurate. Brian may have assumed that Jonathan was neutralized after the first shot, but Brian had the right to change his mind. It was not Brian's responsibility to accurately identify Jonathan's violent capabilities. The physician for the state admitted that Jonathan was capable of moving his arms and legs after the first gunshot, so Brian's story about Jonathan moving is plausible. There was a loaded revolver on the kitchen counter near Jonathan. All he had to do to be dangerous was reach that weapon. It's not like he had to stand up and beat Brian again. It was not Brian's responsibility to remove the revolver. Again, Jonathan made the choice to unlawfully enter the house. Jonathan had repeatedly said that he was going to kill Brian. One could argue that Brian had the right to take him at his word. Considering the trauma that Brian went through, it makes sense that he would have been afraid. If he was more afraid than he should have been, that was Jonathan's fault. Even though, during his interview with the police, Brian seemed confused about how many times he fired, he was upfront about this when he was at Brooke's house. While on the call with 911, Brooke asked him, "Did you shoot him again?" She, of course, was referring to Jonathan. Brian nodded yes, and Brooke communicated his response to the operator. The 911 operator may not have told Brooke to send Brian back into the house, but Brooke may have inadvertently implied that. Maybe Brian became confused about what Brooke was communicating. Like she never said that, but he thought that she did. As far as Jonathan having his hand over his head in the photograph taken by Brian, maybe Jonathan was doing that because he had been injured by the glass bong. Again, Brooke had struck him with the bong earlier in the confrontation. The police created a situation that made Brian feel unsafe by taking 19 minutes to respond to a home invasion in progress. The message this sends to victims is something like, "You need to work this out on your own. We have other things to do." When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Brian Camp was guilty of manslaughter? No, I believe he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury made the right decision by acquitting Brian. There are more doubts in this case than firearms in Brooke's house. The state's case was really about when Jonathan was killed and what Brian believed about Jonathan when he killed him. It was the timing of the gunshots that bothered the state. It seems kind of strange, but the state essentially said that if Brian had killed Jonathan with the first shot, that would have been okay. No worries. That was a justified shooting. Killing him with a second shot would have been fine too, but only if that second shot had come right after the first shot. Waiting 8 minutes, however, was somehow completely unacceptable and was considered to be manslaughter. How would the state have felt if it was 4 minutes or 2 minutes? What's the cutoff? When is Brian no longer allowed to believe that Jonathan was a threat? The state's argument doesn't make a lot of sense. There is no way to escape the fact that the state did not know if Jonathan was a threat or not when he was killed, but everybody knew he was a threat a few minutes earlier. Even the state didn't dispute that Brian was allowed to use lethal force against Jonathan when Jonathan attacked him. The state, through their failed attempt to convict Brian, sent a chilling message to victims of home invasion. They essentially said that a homeowner should kill an intruder immediately. Don't give the intruder even a chance to survive. Self-defense is great, but make it snappy. This is the wrong message. This was caused by an ill-advised prosecution which put the victim on trial. The state totally ignored the mental health ramifications of being attacked, including the effects of trauma. They also sent a message that victims must react perfectly when taken by surprise in the middle of the night by a dangerous perpetrator. Despite being naked and asleep, the victim should fight with the precision of a Navy SEAL while maintaining the moral clarity of an ethics professor. Now moving to my final thoughts. One lesson that can be learned in this case is that if someone chooses to keep firearms in a home for self-defense, the weapons need to be accessible in order to be useful. When listening to the testimony at trial, it sounded like Brooks' house was virtually constructed of firearms. It was like a firearm museum. There were guns everywhere, in a closet, on a service cart, on the kitchen counter, and on top of a kitchen cabinet. Even with all these guns, Brian took a beating before he was able to get to one that he could use to stop Jonathan. There wasn't a gun in reach of where he was sleeping. Home invasions may be rare, but they always come at times that are inconvenient to innocent people. The only way to be safe is to always be prepared. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brian Camp. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. I always find it curious when the police imply that they are the only ones that should use guns against dangerous offenders. Like a gun in the hands of a police officer is somehow a tool of justice and safety, but a gun in the hand of a private citizen is something that is prone to be misused. When violence occurs, of course, like a home invasion, the police aren't there. The homeowner is there. So in addition to this false idea that only the police can use guns, the police aren't around with their guns when violent perpetrators are attacking people. If a person wants to maintain a gun for self-defense, then they should be responsible with it. They should keep it in a location where it's safe, and they should be trained on how to use it legally. But the idea that only the police can do this is ridiculous. It is simply not supported by science. This case illustrates how the dangerous component for a private citizen is being falsely accused of a crime. The police are much less likely to be accused of misusing a firearm. If a private citizen uses a firearm in self-defense, even in their home, they could be charged unless they carry out the self-defense perfectly. Again, this case sends a terrible message. It's a message that I imagine home invaders would feel good about, but law-abiding homeowners would not feel confident by the message sent in this case.